Greetings, this lecture is on decision-making biases. We've already introduced this topic sort of lightly when we were discussing different perceptual distortions that one might have in how we perceive things, and really what those distortions end up is a decision-making bias. Our brain is always looking for ways to simplify things. Our brain is always looking for ways to find the path of least resistance. And sometimes it's a good thing, and sometimes oversimplifying can create problems for us. So we'll go through and talk about different decision-making biases, and this will help you with your Columbia case as well as many of the other assignments you'll have in class. So the next slide, how did I fall for that? And really, we always feel like we can overcome biases or that we're immune to it because, well, we're smart or we're educated. And to be perfectly honest, just as we're fooled by optical illusions, we can be fooled by decision-making biases because, again, decision-making biases comes from the natural tendencies of our brain to try to make sense of the world. And so, will we all be subject to decision-making biases? Absolutely. Can we minimize that impact or avoid it? Minimize is probably really good. You can avoid some of the major pitfalls really by making sure we're training, bringing awareness to decision-making biases so that when we see them, it sets off a red flag for us. Being more mindful in the way that we make decisions and really following our checklist, if you will, of the things that we're supposed to do. I love the checklist manifesto, and we will be listening to that in class. But the important thing around that checklist manifesto is, we have a checklist so we can avoid decision-making biases affecting us when we have very standardized, programmed decisions to make. What you're going to see as we start going through this material is that a lot of these biases overlap each other. And in fact, some biases then contribute to certain other biases in terms of outcomes. And for example, an overconfidence bias may result in us having, what we think to be 20/20 vision about what happened in the past. But our judgments, of course, are flawed. So, we'll see how these things relate and overlap with each other as we move through each of the slides. The first slide of the biases that we'll be talking about is the overconfidence bias. And really what it comes down to is we have more confidence in our judgments than we should. We are actually very overconfident. And this is not uncommon because we always have a higher perception of ourselves and our abilities than perhaps others do. But this can be a problem when we're trying to convince somebody of something and in fact we're not completely sure this is going to work, although we have a high probability. Basically, if you say, I am 99% sure this is going to happen, or I'm 100% sure, I guarantee it, that's the first red flag you need to raise for yourself. Because when someone says they're absolutely 100% sure or 99% sure, the bottom line is they're overestimating what they're capable of doing. The more comfortable we are, the more knowledgeable we are, the more realistic our estimates are. So we tend then to think, well, I'm fairly certain, maybe 75% sure this will happen. There is always the possibility A, B, C, and D could happen, but we have a high probability of, X, Y, and Z occurring, so this is a good option for us. Again, when you're knowledgeable, you don't need to use hubris or your ego to try to convince somebody else of something. And the bottom line is if you are knowledgeable about it, you let your knowledge lead the way. You let the knowledge convince the individual that this is going to work. And so that's why a lot of times we see good leaders are not necessarily leaders who have a position in the company, but good leaders are people who are knowledgeable and can direct people in an appropriate way, and they become a leader, a de facto leader. Even if they don't have a position power, they certainly have knowledge and power in that manner, which is kind of fun and interesting. So how does overconfidence bias happen? What what's one of the primary reasons, or some of the primary reasons why it occurs? Well, first of all, we have this illusion, as I said, that we are much better than what we really are. This illusion of superiority that, oh, I'm educated, I'm smart, people look up to me, so therefore, I cannot make any mistakes. So I have to be superior, I have to be excellent, and I have to be perfect at what I do, so that sometimes that drive for perfection will drive people to be very overconfident in what they can do. The other thing that contributes to overconfidence is this belief that somehow you can manage random events. We can't predict random events. They're random for a reason, because they're random. So anything could occur. Anything could, throw a curveball into the process that you've designed, no matter how carefully you've designed it. There are many things we can't anticipate because, again, our brains are very limited in the data that we can process. Remember, 7 to 9 pieces of information is about all we can manage. So, there may be a number of things out there that we can't even consider. So it's very important that we recognize that random is random. It is not something we can control. It's not something we can predict. Again, talked about the limited ability to know all the outcomes. The other one is seeking confirming evidence. Whenever we are looking to support our arguments, which then pushes us to lead with a lot of overconfidence, is that we look for confirming evidence and we don't look for disconfirming evidence. The more knowledgeable a person is, the more they recognize that there is confirming evidence and disconfirming evidence, that there are times when it works and times when it doesn't work, and you have to know that full range of what can occur in order for you to really feel knowledgeable about what a potential outcome may be. So a lot of times what we do as people is we look for evidence that supports our arguments, not disclaims our arguments. And so it's really important that we not only look for things that support us, but we also look for things that are going to shut our idea down. As much as that feels scary, if we can find things that may potentially shoot our idea down, and our idea is still strong, then there's more confidence in our results. But if we are ignoring anything that could potentially shoot our idea down, then we're going to be in a lot more trouble. Lastly, it's very easy for us to remember all of our successes when we tend to forget failures. But as we all know, the greatest place where we can learn is through failure, not through success. Success just reinforces what we feel we already know. Failures and learning from failures is really where we can gain the most information to ensure we're more successful now and in the future. The next decision-making bias we'll discuss is the inertia bias. And we're already familiar with the inertia bias from listening to the Jonah Lehrer audio interview when he walked into the cereal aisle and he had, paralysis by analysis. He spent so much time trying to gather information and felt so much pressure to make the perfect decision that he put off the decision because he was afraid to commit to a particular outcome. And so when we see that there may be a conflict in our choices, when they're almost equally weighted, it's very easy for us to get caught up in analyzing and trying to push back having to make a decision. Now, analyzers can fall victim to this pretty quickly, and so it's really important that you as analytical decision makers recognize that you can get caught in this inertia bias, that there comes a point when you have to pull the trigger, when you have to make a decision, and it doesn't have to be perfect, but if you've done a good job really situating out what are the most important factors and deciding how they're weighted, relatively well. You should be able to overcome this particular bias. So we also sometimes engage in inertia bias when we feel something is kind of unpleasant, when we're really don't want to deal with the outcomes, or at least in the short term. Perhaps if the long-term gain is good, we should make that decision, but sometimes you have to stumble through some challenges before you can get to the good stuff, and a lot of times I think we see this in our own lives. We may be in relationships with people who are, not good for us, but we stick it out because the thought of breaking up is just so horrific. Or, we break up with them, but the pain is so bad, we go back to them because we just don't know how to break free of that. Or, again, recognizing that we're going to have to make some really difficult changes in our company. We have a massive strategy change that we need to go through. It's going to shake our culture up tremendously. And so it's really easy to turn around and go, let's find another strategy, rather than saying, look, this is going to be really ugly for now, but in the long run, this is better for us. And this is, again, kind of what IBM faced. There was enormous unpleasantness, having to change the culture, change the way they do things, and yet, in the end, it was a good thing for them to do. They really had to just buckle down and push through the pain and the unpleasantness in order to get to that other side. So inertia is about avoidance, either avoidance of conflict or avoidance of unpleasantness. But either way, it's about avoiding things. We don't want to make the decision, or we don't feel like we're ready to make that decision yet. Immediate gratification bias is the opposite side of the same problem we have with inertia bias. Whereas inertia bias, we are resistant to acting or resistant to making the decision. Immediate gratification is the opposite of that, and we're so ready to jump in, we may actually jump in way too soon, which can be a very, very big problem. And certainly we see Wall Street is engaged in this sort of activity, this whole quarteritis idea of quarterly earnings and how important this quarter's earnings are. When we realize it's a ridiculous notion that, the long term really needs to be our focus, not just these short-term quarter fluctuations. When we're caught in that, that's very problematic for us. So immediate gratification means that we don't want to postpone any kind of pleasure, or we don't want to postpone, whatever the perceived reward is. We want to jump in right away. It tends to be a very short-term focus. We don't really think about the long-term implications of what we do. And we don't have a sense of what it is that we want to see in the future, because we're not even thinking of the future. We're only thinking right here and right now. The thing is with mindfulness, even though mindfulness says we have to be in the present, mindfulness is also about understanding the impact that our actions have on those that come after us, or on our future, whatever that might be. So bringing mindfulness grounds us in the moment, but it enables us to think more broadly than just, what I need right now, and so therefore I'm going to go and I'm going to grab it right away, and I don't care what the implications are for the long-term issue. You think about Bausch and Lomb and what Bausch and Lomb did in terms of, they needed to they overstated their earnings a number of years ago because there was so much pressure on them or perceived pressure to increase this growth that they had. And so with this pressure to increase this growth, they had this very short-term focus. We need to grow every year. It's really important. It's really important. And in the end, they overstated their earnings to make it look like they were more successful than they were, and it had long-term negative ramifications for Bausch and Lomb. A, as a good company and one that people could trust, and B, as a good investment. So our goal with immediate gratification is taking a moment and stopping and breathing and centering ourselves, and then thinking, does this have to be done now? What is the implication of by doing this, will there be a long-term concern or issue that I have? So that's the things we need to focus on. Anchoring biases are a challenge for us because a lot of times when someone gives us some information, we're anchored to that piece of information, and it's very hard for us to break free from that, to think, could there be an alternative solution besides the parameters that you gave us? So you might say, hey, I'm interested in this, and so here's an idea, and because I throw the idea at you as opposed to allowing you to do the brainstorming, you're anchored to the idea that I threw out at you, and then we don't investigate any other possible alternatives out there. So we need to keep in mind that if someone's providing information for us or providing something to us, that the primacy effect, right, the first thing that comes to us is one that is prone to huge biases. We get anchored to that initial idea and find it really hard to break free. It's like, when I was talking about the moonwalking bear solution, if I say to you, here's your choices, it's A or B, and this is what you need to do, I'm anchoring you and looking at the team in white who is throwing the ball and how many times they pass it, that you're anchored to that as, well, that's the only thing that I need to worry about in this video, and realize there's more to it. So what you're looking for is being able to step outside of that initial idea, and it might be a good idea, but it doesn't. We want to be careful that we're not throwing away other ideas or not exploring other paths just because we got stuck in this one place first. Sometimes people will do that to us purposefully. They'll anchor us to this idea and we feel like, well, that sounds like a great idea. We satisfy, we simplify. It's the easiest thing to do, so we stick with that initial idea as opposed to really exploring what might be more optimal. The effect is the most prevalent, as it says there, when there's a lack of objective information to compare it against. And I like to use the idea of thinking about how does one value, or how did one value, a credit default swap, when it came to those instruments used during the whole mortgage debacle in the late 2008, 9, 10 time. People will tell you that they could not, for the life of them, figure out how to value a credit default swap. So someone said, hey, how about X? And that's what stuck. It wasn't because there was any value to what a credit default swap was worth. It doesn't have any inherent value. Someone assigned a value, independent of, anything other than what they thought it might be worth. And that's the thing that started to be the downfall. If it doesn't have any inherent value and you're fixated on this idea, you don't question whether or not the idea is actually good. You start to just go along with the flow. Right? We want to be also careful when we're in very ambiguous situations. Trivial information can get tossed at us, and that's the stuff that we may anchor to. So again, think about an anchor as this heavy anchor weighing around your head, and you're sort of stuck, at this idea or this place or this thing, and we have it very difficult for us to move away from that idea. So when it's very ambiguous, don't assume that the trivial information is always the most valuable stuff. You need to really take your time, even in a crisis, to explore and not get stuck just looking at the trivia. There may be other things out there that we need to pay attention to. Our next decision-making bias is selective perception. And what this basically means is when we are in uncertain or ambiguous conditions, we are very much influenced by our lens and the way that we view the world, rather than the stimulus itself. It's so easy for us with our attitudes, our interests, our backgrounds, and experiences to layer our interpretation on something rather than taking the stimulus for what it is. It is very challenging for us to objectively see things around us, to see events and to see the world through different eyes. And so our goal is, part of it, what I'm doing with this class, with the ethical lens exercise and the simulation, is really teaching you to see the world through those different eyes. Really going back to the words of Joan Allaire, on how we need to really think about seeing the world and walking in someone else's shoes, stepping outside of the moral matrix, not being for or against, but just seeing the argument for the value of the argument. Does it make sense? You don't have to agree with it, but does it make logical sense based on what they value? And once you understand what someone's core issues and core values are, it makes it a lot easier to have a discussion about how you can find common ground in a solution. So selective perception is the thing that puts us in that us versus them mentality, that our way is right and everybody else's way is wrong, and therefore we're only going to engage in things that are consistent with our lens, and that's not always the right way to approach it. So the next bias is the confirmation bias, and I've already introduced it a little bit. With confirmation bias, what we're doing is giving weight to information that we already know or that we already believe to be true. And so as we find information that supports those views, we give an enormous amount of weight to them, but we ignore things that might be disconfirming. We ignore things that might say, no, this idea may not be so right. And we discount it and say, oh, it couldn't possibly be right. It's a bad study. It's bad this. It's bad that. We subjectively gather data. It's not objective. We'd like to believe it's objective. We may try to approach objectivity. But remember, we all have different lenses. We all weight things very differently in our heads and our minds, and we look at the world in our own unique way. So it is almost impossible for us to be strictly objective in the way that we gather our data. I remember having a student once, and we were talking about how he would make sure somebody followed the rules the way he wanted to have it set up to be able to do something. In his company, he says, well, I would just logically lay out the facts, and of course they'll understand. I'm like, but it's logical according to whom? Because it might feel logical to you, but it might not feel logical to the person sitting next to you. And the class was in agreement, and it took him a while to recognize that the idea that someone else might view his logical ideas as not so logical, was just a foreign idea to him. Eventually he got it, but it was sort of an interesting revelation for somebody who was very, very left-brained, logical, rational, everything fits in, into an orderly world. He was an engineer, and it was a very orderly world in which he liked to set up things, and he had to recognize that it was about his subjectivity. He was viewing this as logical and rational, but it was all based on the way he saw it, not the way it might be objectively viewed by others. So why do we engage in this confirmation bias? Well, mostly because we like consistency. We don't like things that are inconsistent. It drives us nuts. Now, that's not meaning that we are OCD and everything has to be orderly and what have you, but we want to see things happen consistently. We want to know if I do X, Y is going to happen. And so the consistency is something that we seek. So the confirming evidence just feeds into that need to have that consistency. And so when we get the confirming evidence, we go, see, I was right all along. And again, our goal with consistency is to get rid of the complexity or the things that might challenge, our worldview and our comfort zone. And here's the thing. Being in our comfort zone is never going to stretch us and push us to learn new things. When you find yourself going, oh, that's not the way I've done it before, or, that's not comfortable, that's the first clue that you need to push through it. You don't want to sit, in that discomfort anymore. It's really important that you figure out, how do I get out of this discomfort of having things that are really complex and really unpredictable, and allow myself to just be with that and not have it bother me that I can't create the order that I want. Sometimes complex issues are complex, and there's no way we're going to be able to manage all the moving parts to come up with the solution to the problem. So, we engage in that confirmation bias because it's our natural way for us to make things more predictable. But, when we're feeling our need to make sure it's consistent and neat and orderly, and we want only things that are, consistent with our belief systems, that's the first clue that we need to recognize that there's going to be some discomfort. Let it go. The discomfort's a natural part of learning from our failures and learning from our experiences. And every moment that we sit in that discomfort is just another data point for us to learn new things. Whether or not we're consciously doing it, our brain is always unconsciously processing this stuff. Framing biases are interesting because we tend to frame things in a way that makes the most sense to us. Just like a photographer frames a photo because they want your eye to fall on the bug on the flower or the clouds in the background. It's framed in a way because that's how you want people to interpret the message. We do this all the time when we're trying to influence someone. We narrow their focus in on the things that we think are the most important to try to have them ignore the man behind the curtain, kind of like that whole Wizard of Oz things, just focus on, the spewing, character in the front with the flames coming out of their nose and the smoke rising up. Don't look at me behind the curtain. So We want to frame, so we want people to believe things the way we want them to believe it. We see this all the time in advertising and in our appeals and the way that we influence people. And this is not to say that this is necessarily a bad thing, particularly if the intention is that we want people to stay healthy, or we want people to not engage in bad behaviors, right? We want to frame things in a way so they really get the underlying message, which is don't do this, or please do this. This is what we need. So, some of the things that we need to think about when it comes to framing is that perceived losses are treated very differently than perceived gains. This is a lot of the Kahneman and Tversky stuff about risk, right? When we have an outcome that we don't want to lose, okay, we want to hold on to this outcome as much as possible. We're incredibly risk-taking because we'll do whatever it takes to avoid the loss. We don't want to lose. On the other hand, you're in the situation where you may have a outcome that we want to keep the gain. We want to gain something. So in order for us to gain something and not lose it, we act more in a way that is more risk averse. So the outcome is something that we want. We're not going to risk anything to lose that opportunity to gain that thing. But when the outcome is something we could potentially lose, we are going to be as risk-taking as possible in order to achieve it. So in essence, if your probability is that you might lose it, is much higher than you're going to gain it, you're going to be very risk-taking. But if the probability is more that you're going to gain something, then we are much more risk-averse in that situation. And that was an interesting, the risk relationship is something that people recognize, and it applies in investments and things like that, where people they're willing to do whatever it takes to make the buck, but they don't want to lose it. So, when there's an opportunity to once you have it, you don't want to lose it. So therefore, you act very conservatively in order to retain it. But, when your chances are so slim and you have the potential loss, you definitely are going to engage in the risk in order to get that investment the way you want it. So there are many different ways that framing bias enters into our decision-making frameworks. One is risky choice framing and how we frame risky choices. I mean, because we don't want to risk loss, we work really hard to make sure, whatever it takes, that we're not going to lose something. On the other hand, we want to hold on to what we've gained. We don't want any possibility or probability of losing what we've already gained. So those risky choice things, very different. So in here is a great example of the risky choice. The government is preparing to combat a rare disease expected to take 600 lives. Two alternative programs to combat the disease have been proposed, each of which scientists believe will have a certain consequence. A will save 200 people if adopted. B has a 1/3 chance of saving all 600, but a 2/3 chance of saving no one. And in this situation, we want to maximize. We want to win. We want to save that 600 people, and we're willing to take the risk in order to be able to save all those people. C, and we could change that. C would allow 400 people to die if adopted, and D has a 1/3 chance no one would die and a 2/3 chance all would die. In this case, we're going to be very conservative. We're going to change our approach to these sorts of things. But we can talk more in class and see if people agree or disagree with that framing. But I think, the bottom line is when there's a possibility that we could save more, we're much more likely, to engage in that risky behavior. So, way of thinking about it. Attribute framing, right? We can say something is 75% lean, but it still means it's 25% fat. So, people kind of get caught up in this idea of, oh, it's this, it's that, it's this. And we forget to think about it in the counterfactual way, right? It's like if it's 75% lean, it's 25% fat. So do I still want 25% fat? So we frame it in a way to make it more appealing, but in fact it maybe is not so appealing. If you think about it, something has 25% fat in it. You know, maybe someone doesn't want that in their diet at all. The last way that framing comes into play is goal framing. For example, as I was saying before, sometimes we frame things in a certain way because we want them to focus on the most important factor, which is, you know, regardless of all sorts of other things, if you do breast exams, you're going to increase the likelihood of finding a tumor early and getting treated, you know, quickly. So they're framing it in a way that says the affirmative, do this so that you can absolutely find the tumor and then you can get it treated right away. So there's an affirmative argument here. And then you can also do a negative argument. Those don't work as much because I don't know how many of you remember the commercial, and it was a long, long time ago, but it was, you know, they showed an egg and said, this is your brain, and then they cracked it and they put it in a skillet that was already, you know, very hot, and it said, and this is your brain on drugs, you know, any questions? It was a huge scare tactic, and it really wasn't that successful in dissuading people from doing drugs. You know, if you had an intention to do drugs, it didn't matter. Yeah, because that was never going to happen to you anyway. Your brain wouldn't fry like that. And of course, we know that's ridiculous, and of course it does. But nonetheless, you can see sometimes the scare campaigns don't always work as well. So, but again, the framing, the way you frame it around the goal is, if you don't do it, you're going to decrease your chances. And people are less likely to respond to that. You know, they want to know that if I do something, I'm going to gain something, not if I don't do it, I'm going to lose something. So the positive framing tends to work a lot better. Our next bias, the availability bias, has some overlap a little bit with confirmation bias. Basically what availability bias argues is that we make decisions based on the information that's readily available to us because, again, we're sorting through all this information, and many times we may be picking things that seem very consistent with our, you know, worldview. So since we use the things that are available to us, we tend to ignore, you know, the reality of situations. And a good example of this is, you know, we hear of car accidents and airplane accidents, and certainly, you know, there's always, you know, a crash of some sort in the news in the last few years between the Malaysia Air, a couple of Malaysia airplanes, airplane that just crashed in Germany, and where we get this irrational fear of flying, when in reality the chances of us dying in a slip and fall in our bathtub or driving our car, you know, to work is a greater likelihood of dying in that accident than we are in an airplane. The chances of it happening are slim, but because it is such a big event, it is scary, and we feel out of control. That irrationality starts to kick in. Because we say, oh, you know, when a car accident happens, a person dies, maybe two, maybe three. But when a plane crashes, it's hundreds, several hundreds sometimes, depending on, you know, the kind of flight it is. Overseas flights tend to be more. So it's very interesting to see how we tend to respond to stuff, even when it's irrational to think of it that way. The thing with availability bias, too, is it says we're the product of our experiences. You know, things that we see, things that we read, things that we then retain in our heads. We assume that our experiences or the things that we've read or that, you know, is balanced. That, you know, we have, you know, both sides of the arguments in our head, all readily available all the time. And our experiences and the things that we reach out to, because we engage a lot of times in confirmation bias, is not balanced. So we will distort all sorts of things. We don't even realistically look at the risks or the probabilities of something occurring, because all we can think of is, gosh, if I'm in an airplane, you know, 200 of us will die. And that really sticks with us. That's that one incident of having no control and dying in a plane accident is really different than, oh, I can control because I'm the driver, you know, when you're in the car. Experience trumps stats in our mind. So even if the statistics tells you it's not a probable outcome because we may have experienced it ourselves, or or it's something that we have that's readily available to us in terms of this really pronounced, profound experience. We're going to rely on our experience and our gut feel in an unhealthy way, in an inappropriate way, because we're allowing emotion to trump sort of, it becomes overwhelmingly too important. Emotion's great, but too much emotion is a problem, and not enough emotion is a problem. We need to have some degree of emotion to tap into what's appropriate or what's not appropriate, but at the same time, we have to make sure that we're not sitting back and going, well, only my experience matters, regardless of all this data in front of me. In the Kouros statue situation that we talked about in Blink, it's kind of the exact opposite there. They were listening to the stats, and the stats were saying that this is okay, but they weren't listening to their gut that was telling them there's something wrong with this. There's something wrong here. You've got to pay attention to it. And so availability bias happens when we spend too much time focusing on our emotion, and then we have problems if we don't tap enough into our emotions. So it can go both ways, and there's no easy answer to how to get rid of these biases, because the bottom line is a little bit too much in one direction or a little bit not enough in another direction, and we run into problems with our ability to make interpretations of what's in front of us. In the representation bias, we're trying to assess the likelihood of something happening based on how similar it is to other sets of events, right? So basically what we're talking about is, oh, I remember the last time this happened, something like this happened, this was the outcome we had, so, of course the same thing is going to happen again. And the thing is, we don't recognize that what happened in the past happened in the past. It is absolutely not necessarily the same experience, because there's a whole host of different variables that may come into play. It may look the same, but it may not be the same. So one of the problems is that we ignore randomness, and that's one of the next biases we'll talk about, but we ignore that things are random. We ignore that there are no such things as lucky streaks. It may feel like a lucky streak, but the bottom line is it's never really based on luck. If you read Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, it's not about luck. It's about understanding the underlying solutions to the problems, or the underlying cause of the issue. And a great example in Outliers was hockey players. And some of the best hockey players were born in the beginning of the year, January, February, March, and the weaker ones, the weaker players were, born later in the year. And people ask themselves, well, how does that happen? Why are the best hockey players only born in the beginning of the year? Clearly there must be something about being born in the wintertime that affects that. No. What it had to do with is when kids got tracked into certain kinds of training experiences. When they were learning how to play hockey, kids who were born in the beginning of the year, and, with respect to their birthdays, they were bigger and stronger than kids who were born towards the end of the year. I mean, kids grow at different paces, but there's a certain age where kids start growing in leaps and bounds much faster, and so someone who is a January birthday is going to be a lot different than someone who was born almost a year later in November or December. Different levels of emotionality and maturity and physical strength sometimes. That whole year of growing is a big deal. So it wasn't random. I mean, it wasn't a lucky streak. It wasn't something weird about being born in January, February, or March. It really had more to do with the training programs and when they were implemented. And so as you are stronger in the beginning, you go to the better training program, and then that experience keeps building and building and building on itself so that you become that much better than everybody else because of when those training programs were implemented. It's a really, really weird phenomenon, but things aren't random. They really, things aren't like lucky streaks. There really tend to be, things can happen that are very random. Or things can happen because it's not a lucky streak. It's because it's something deeper underneath it that we are, that we're not aware of. When we see outliers, a representation bias is we're looking at something that sticks out and we think, oh, that must be the new trend. But in fact, what we're going to see is a regression to the mean, which means, you might be a high performer this year, but next year you're probably going to become more average again. Or someone who's an extraordinarily low performer one year will probably go back to being average. We tend to fluctuate around our average, up or down. And I'll give you some examples of this in class, but it's really interesting, as we think about analyzing longitudinal data. How far back do you go? 1 year, 2 years, 5 years? We need to see enough to see some sort of trend, to see patterns. Looking at 2 or 3 data points is not going to tell us that there's a trend in anything. And that becomes the issue. We see an outlier and we assume, oh, this must be the new data level, and in fact it's not. It just happened to be, one of those really cool, weird years, and then everything's sort of adjusted backwards again. The last thing, too, is this idea with sample sizes, where we see, 3 out of 5 dentists prefer blah, 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 whatever that is. Well, are we then talking about 300 out of 500? Are we talking about 3,000 out of 5,000? Whatever it is, are we really talking about only 3 or 5 dentists, or are we talking about more of a proportions? And so, and ratios, right? Obviously, the dental example is much more about the ratio, but a lot of times people, put a lot of weight in, well, I looked at 5 people, 3 said this, so that must be true, and because that's what we see in front of us, and in fact, it's just a very, very small sample, and we need a larger sample, just like I said, we need more data points to see trends, we need larger samples to see whether or not this thing that we're seeing is actually realistically true. And following up to this idea of coping with randomness, we struggle with chance happenings, which is why, our dopamine wants patterns. Our dopamine wants rewards. Our dopamine wants to predict that something's going to happen. And so we start to ascribe a pattern when there isn't one. And so we have to recognize sometimes it's just random, that there is no reason for it to occur. It doesn't mean that we don't try to find what might be a source, like the whole idea of the hockey players being born in those months. That's not random. That's not there's not a real cause there. That somehow being born in January or February or March is better, physically, for a hockey player, regardless of all the other factors. You have to dig a little bit deeper and realize, see, it's not, if you see a pattern, it's not because, you're on a lucky streak. It's really because, there is a reason, and you have to look at it and see what it is that's contributing to that pattern. But we also have to recognize sometimes random things do occur. Don't assume you have a pattern when you don't have enough data points yet. When you have enough data points, then you can start to say, wow, why does this pattern happen? Then you start to, dig in a little bit. We just have to recognize in shorter time frames, random things happen, and sometimes they happen, as a coincidence. It looks similar. It might be, luck, things that kind of pull it together. But really, the bottom line is there isn't. There's not this idea of, patterns, in sort of a couple of random points. I know people talk about their lucky underwear and how, if I have my lucky underwear on, I always win. Well, maybe it's because you put the lucky underwear on and it gives you a surge of confidence. Maybe it really isn't the lucky underwear, but you've decided, like a placebo effect, you've decided that it's going to be good for you. And so you put more time practicing, and then you put on the underwear and you have more confidence, and then you are more focused when you're at the, you're at home plate trying to, catch that curveball as it gets thrown at you. So it isn't necessarily, just luck. So sunk costs are one of those things that we all get caught into. We sort of feel like, I've already invested money and time into this, just a little bit more and it'll be okay. Just a little bit more and this will worthwhile. This will be worthwhile and it'll work. The problem is we start throwing good money after bad. We've already thrown resources into something. It was a bad decision. Own it. It wasn't a good idea. I thought it was. It happens. And own it and move on. Cut your losses and move forward. But the problem is people are so concerned about looking indecisive or looking like they're wasteful or trying to save face because their ego's involved in the process rather than truly, realistically assessing the situation and recognizing we've already put $3 million into this project and it's still not going anywhere. Why should we put any more money into it? It's not working. So our goal then is really to not allow ourselves to get stuck in, well, I've already invested so much, so what's another couple $100 or another couple $1 million? Well, yeah, it's a lot. You have to be able to realistically assess at every juncture whether or not something realistically can improve or will benefit from further resources. And it's really hard for us to do that. Sometimes we get caught in our own ego stuff. It avoids, makes us avoid looking at the realism of the outcomes that we don't really want to look at. So limited search bias is very similar to confirmation bias in that when we're looking for information, confirmation bias says we're going to look for things that are confirming what we already believe. Limited search says we're going to look for stuff to make things really easy for us to solve problems. I mean, think about the whole chocolate cake thing, right? When it was a really complex situation, we made the choice for the chocolate cake, hands down. When things were less complex and our brain was using less, processing power, we were able to really think through, a more reasonable solution. So our limited search happens because we're trying to simplify, no matter how much, we think that we're, living a simple, easy, life. Our lives are fairly complex. We're bombarded with data regularly. It's on our cell phones and it's on our computers and it's on our office and our Blackberries or whatever it is we're using these days. And we need to keep it simple in order to make sure we can function. But sometimes, you overly simplify. Again, we're bounded in our rationality. We're very limited. And so it's okay to satisfy us, but first of all, we don't want to engage in an anchoring bias where we only use the first alternative and say, yeah, that's fine, let's go with it. That may not work. Sometimes we need to do a little bit more in-depth research. Those directive people can be very prone to limited search or anchoring biases because they want to make a quick decision and they want to move on to the next thing. Let your analyzers come into play here and recognize that, we got to do a little analysis. We've got to figure it out. One way to think about this is the search that you're doing compatible with the values and goals and plans and your plans for those goals. So if you are in a situation where you have limited your search, you're not really doing justice to what your goal is overall. And if you're in a situation where you're analyzing too much, that's a problem too. Again, it's all about finding that middle ground, the balance, recognizing a little bit too much in this direction is a problem. Not enough in this direction is also a problem. So limited search, if we're not looking enough, that's a problem for us. And I loved Einstein's quote, everything should be as simple as possible, but not simpler. Because if it's simpler than that, we're not getting enough information. If it's too complex, we can't process it. We've got to figure out what's the simplest way that we can bring this problem down and focus on the simplest way to solve the problem without making it more complex that it makes people's brains explode. When we can break our decisions down into the most fundamental elements, the most important issues with respect to making a decision, then and only then can we keep things as simple as possible. Again, remember the balance between the brain being too much overloaded and then not having enough information. We need the essential elements, the essential issues that are the most important to the decision. We have a few more biases to go. The next one is emotional involvement. And, just as we talked about ignoring emotions and how ignoring emotions can hurt us and our ability to make decisions, too much emotion, again, that other extreme, can make us more focused on the dopamine and the emotional rush than on taking our time and really thinking about things as more objectively, as more objective as we can. When we're stressed out, we always make emotional decisions. We make the emotional decision to grab the chocolate cake because our brain has just been so busy and complex with so many other things that we really can't make a good decision about should I have the cake or the fruit salad. Negative emotions we try to avoid. And what negative emotions do is it narrows our focus because we're like in fight or flight, right? And because we're in fight or flight, we're more apt to engage in impulsive behaviors. And so our goal is, when we feel these negative emotions, to not let those negative emotions drive us to make a hasty decision, to engage in instant gratification or some sort of horrendous avoidance behavior by moving in the opposite direction of something. Sometimes you have to work through that discomfort to get to the other side because the negative emotions are temporary, they're fleeting. They'll go away and you'll come through on the other side of it. So when we're stressed out, this is a problem. And emotions become the thing that when we're very excited about something, that dopamine starts pumping. And it just enables us to just continue to go because we feel like, oh, this is a great idea, it's wonderful, it's great, it's a self-feeding mechanism, right? The more the dopamine's pumping, the more we're like, yeah, this is the bright idea, this is what we got to do, and you're not, your feet aren't on the ground. You have to be thinking, try to be more grounded in your approach to those decisions. Self-serving bias is also fairly common, again, because we have this overinflated view of our own capabilities. We always take credit for our successes, and when we fail, we blame others for our failures. It's all their fault. I'm good at what I do, and so if I didn't succeed, it's because everybody else didn't do their part. That self-serving bias flips on its head. It makes a very huge fundamental attribution error when it's somebody else assessing you. While you'll take credit for your success, the other person, when they're assessing you, will only give you credit, or give you give you credit for your failures. They'll say, well, you're the reason why you failed. You're the reason why you did this wrong, even though that may not have been the case. A fundamental attribution error basically says, you are the cause for your failures, but you were just lucky. You weren't the cause for your success. You were the cause for your failures. So it's kind of the opposite side of the coin. During failures, we underestimate the external factors for others, right? We downplay that there may have been extenuating circumstances for a reason why you failed, and we overestimate that you failed because you're not good, because you're not smart, because you don't have the skills, because you are not good at what you do. And so again, this is always what we do because we always want to make ourselves look good. The last thing I would want is to have to take a look at myself and say, wow, I'm the reason why you failed. As a boss, right? Bosses engage in that fundamental attribution error because they don't want to look at themselves and say, I screwed up. I'm the reason why you were not successful, and I have to take ownership of that. Good bosses will do that. Good bosses will recognize that, but many bosses won't do that at all. Our last bias is the hindsight bias, and what the hindsight bias is the tendency to believe, and falsely at that we'd have accurately predicted the outcome of an event only after that outcome is known. Basically, it's like we go, oh yeah, I knew it. I knew this would happen. That's that hindsight is 20/20 thing. It's like, yeah, if I were back in that moment, I would absolutely know that. I knew that for sure. I knew that was going to happen. Well, and in fact, we didn't. And what our current experience is and the current outcome clouds the way we think about what happened in the past. And why does this sort of thing occur? Well, because we are really bad at recalling past events. That's why when it comes to court cases, we like multiple witnesses. One witness it's prone to a lot of bias. But if I have triangulation with several witnesses all giving me pretty much the same result, then I have a very different story to tell there. The goal would be that I want to have as many data points as possible to make sure I'm not engaging in this hindsight bias, where I'm looking back and assuming that I knew things, that I was able to reconstruct things in a way, and in fact I'm overestimating it. Again, back to that, I'm overestimating because I'm smart, I'm good, I have great memory. Of course that's how I remember it. Of course I would have done well in it. And we all do this very casually. It only becomes a major issue when we're dealing with this in the workplace and we're trying to figure out how to learn from our failures and how to decide what's the right way to do things. What were the factors that contributed to the failure? Don't just say, oh, I knew it. Well, how did you know it? Or if you knew it, why didn't you say something? We have to really recognize that if we don't acknowledge where we have failed, appropriately acknowledge where we failed, we're not going to learn from our past mistakes. So if we always say, well, yeah, I knew it, then you're not giving yourself the opportunity to actually say how you knew it and why you knew it and make sure that we don't make that mistake again. So with all these biases, given that we see all these major overlaps, how do we avoid these problems with biases? Always look for disconfirming evidence. Right? Don't always allow yourself to get stuck in this place where I'm looking for the data that's only going to prove that I'm right. Look for data that proves that you're wrong. Maybe you won't find it, but you have to give it a shot because you want to know if this truly is the right option. Be really self-aware. Are you impatient? Are you hesitant? Are you very risky? Know these things about yourself. If you know that you tend to be very impatient about things, take a deep breath and step back. If you tend towards overconfidence on things, stop, take a step back. Try to be more realistic. Try to gather more data in order to help you with that. Push yourself regularly to think beyond the short term, but also to think about the long-term implications of something that you do. Because the more that we start to push the long time frame, even though it's not our natural tendency here in the U.S. based on our culture, the long-term time frame will help us to avoid some of these biases in many ways. Framing. Think about alternative framing. You might get excited that something's 75% fat-free until you realize it's 25% fat. So, and what that really means in the big picture. So, flip the framing on its head. Think about it in a different way. And see if your arguments and your excitement for the idea still holds. If you can flip the framing and it still sounds good, then that's a good choice. But if you flip the framing and go, oh, I never thought about it that way, then you realize that maybe you're being misled by the framing. Work to try to understand the world from somebody else's point of view. This helps you with negotiations, it helps you with personal relationships, it helps you with all sorts of things. But really what it does is it helps you communicate with others. So we want to be able to walk in someone else's shoes. And so starting to practice that, trying to shut down, step outside of that moral matrix and look in a very different way towards what you think things should be. Expand your experiences. Don't get stuck in the rut of doing the same thing the same way all the time. The more experiences you have, the more you're building up a database of synapse connections in your head, in your brain. And then the more of those experiences add to the overall totality of what your brain database is processing, you're more likely to avoid decision-making biases because you're seeing things with those different eyes because you've had different experiences. Next, if it's too good to true, it's probably not true. If it feels like, oh my God, I can't believe this, this is just too good to be true, yeah, it probably is. There's probably a catch that you weren't aware of. I remember as a kid, my sister got caught up in this thing, and she said, oh, I'm so certain that this is going to be a really good thing. We're going to go and we're going to take Mom and Dad to Hawaii, and it's $400 and it's going to be awesome, and they're going to go to Hawaii and it's going to be great. And I'm saying, this just didn't seem right. This seemed too good to be true. And sure enough, we dug and we couldn't find any bad evidence that this was a good thing. We Kept digging and digging and digging, still couldn't find it. Something still told me it wasn't right. Sure enough, it wasn't right. And in fact, we had to get our money back because the trip ended up being, a fake. But my sister was very caught up in it. It just seemed too good to be true. And honestly, it was too good to be true. It really was not a good result. Next, sometimes random events are random. Recognize that random is going to happen. Random will happen. If you start to see patterns, be careful also how you make the attribution of why that pattern occurs. It's not because you're wearing your lucky underwear. It might be because every time you put on that underwear and you think you're wearing your lucky underwear, you're just working harder. That might be really the reason. So be careful of how we ascribe what patterns are telling us. Sometimes it is random. Sometimes there is a pattern, but it's not a pattern for the reasons that you're attributing to it. It may be a completely different reason. Look outside the box for the non-obvious alternatives, the moonwalking bear alternatives. Look outside of the blinders. Peek up, look around, and see what's out there. Next, manage your emotions. You don't want to be devoid of emotion, but you don't want too much emotion. It's really important that you find a way to balance it so that we are not in a place where we have too much emotion and taking us away in terms of super emotionality and not being able to focus on things. On the other hand, the last thing we want is a situation where we have not enough emotion, where we're not engaging in the right decision-making process.